For decades, D&D has been a mainstay of basements, kitchen tables, and convention halls everywhere. It's the one RPG that transcends tabletop role-playing and remains a permanent fixture of pop culture. Since its launch in the 1970s, there have been hundreds of tabletop RPG supplements, novels, dozens of video games, an animated series, a film series, and much, much more. Dungeons & Dragons is, in and of itself, a billion-dollar industry. But where did it come from? Who were the people that made Dungeons & Dragons the colossus that it is today? And what does the future look like for D&D? Follow me through the maze that is the history of gaming's most popular brand, and don't forget to check for traps. Roll 2d10. If you're a tabletop RPG aficionado, chances are you have a miniature somewhere in your home. You might even use it to represent your D&D character. Or perhaps you play one of the hundreds of popular miniature war games on the market like Warhammer 40k or Battletech. Well, it turns out that's where all our favorite RPGs, including D&D, got their start. Miniature wargaming dates to at least the late 1800s when Robert Louis Stevenson was documented using toy soldiers to reenact historic battles. Later in 1913, author H.G. Wells published a book called Little Wars, which would be accepted as the standard rule set for miniature wargames for many years to come. But the hobby of miniature wargames remained modest for decades, lacking any central community, magazines, or real organization. Then, in 1956, the first wargaming convention was organized in California by Jack Scrubby, aka the father of modern wargaming. For the next decade, the hobby slowly grew in popularity thanks to innovators like Scrubby, Donald Featherstone, Tony Bath, and others. Clubs and federations began to spring up throughout the 1960s, one of which was the International Federation of Wargamers. One of the IFW's co-founders, Gary Gygax, organized a wargaming convention in his hometown of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin in 1968. Gygax and his friends couldn't have known it at the time, but the first ever Lake Geneva convention, also known as the Gen Con, would change their lives and ultimately the future of gaming forever. But more on that later. With some positive forward momentum from their gaming enterprises in the late 60s, Gygax and several friends, Don Kay, Mike Reese, and Leon Tucker, created the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association. Meeting regularly in Gygax's basement to play and discuss games, this team developed the rules for the game Chainmail, a miniature war game set in medieval times. The first edition of Chainmail was published by Guidon Games in 1971, where Gygax was working as an editor. It was the company's biggest hit, selling 100 copies per month. One of the elements that made Chainmail so popular with fans was the inclusion of a 14-page fantasy supplement that included heroes, wizards, dragons, and other fantasy elements influenced by authors like Tolkien and Moorcock. Over the next year, Gygax continued to develop new editions of Chainmail, as well as collaborating on other miniature war games. In the fall of 1972, Gygax met with game designer Dave Arneson. He immediately saw the potential in Arneson's Blackmoor, a fantasy campaign setting, and agreed to collaborate with him to create a new fantasy game. Gygax got to work immediately on a campaign setting of his own, dubbed Greyhawk, using a version of Arneson's play rules. He sent the first 50-page draft of Greyhawk out to the community, and ran lengthy campaigns of his own to playtest the new game. When all was said and done, Gygax revised the rulebook into a 150-page tome. This new system was presented to Guidon, but the sheer size of the game was beyond the scope of the small publisher. Even Avalon Hill, the largest wargaming company at the time, passed on it. Not only was Gygax's manuscript really long, but the idea of role-playing just didn't make sense to them. So in 1973, Gary Gygax and Don Kay founded Tactical Studies Rules, TSR Incorporated, to publish Dungeons & Dragons. Each invested $1,000 of their own money to print the box sets of the new game. But $2,000 wasn't much cash, even by 1970 standards. So to raise additional revenue, TSR first put out a miniature game called Cavaliers and Roundheads. This probably wasn't the smartest idea to raise capital. Sales of the minigame were pretty mediocre, which meant that TSR risked failure at being first to market with this brand new role-playing game concept. Enter Brian Bloom. This fellow gamer came along offering $2,000 to the struggling new company in exchange for an equal partnership. Gygax was enthusiastic about the partnership, but Kay was hesitant. After much consideration and interrogation, Kay finally agreed. TSR published the first boxed sets of D&D in 1974 for $10. Dice were extra. These box sets were hand-assembled at the headquarters of TSR, otherwise known as Gary Gygax's basement. The initial print runs sold out in the first year, and things were looking bright for the young game designers at TSR. People really connected with the game, and demand soared. Tragically, Don Kay suffered a fatal heart attack in January of 1975, leaving the future of the company in flux. Kay didn't leave any special instructions for his share of the company, leaving his entire estate to his wife. Donna Kay had done some accounting for TSR, but she didn't share Don's interest in gaming. She made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with the management of the company, reportedly dumping all the TSR material on Gygax's front porch. To acquire the rights to D&D, which was still the property of the previous three-way partnership, Kay's shares would have to be purchased from his widow. Because business.
Is there, money involved in this?
Of course, sir, there's money involved. I'm a businessman.
Bloom persuaded Gygax to let his father purchase Donna's shares since neither of the two of them had the money. Reluctantly, Gygax agreed, and Melvin and Brian Bloom became primary shareholders of the company. Meanwhile, a second and third print run of D&D was selling like gangbusters. TSR continued to create and print multiple miniature wargames, as well as multiple supplements for D&D. Between 1975 and 1976, TSR produced the D&D supplements Eldritch Wizardry, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, Swords and Spells, Rules for Miniature Warfare, Blackmoor, and Greyhawk. These supplements introduced new character classes, rules, creatures, and more to the game of D&D, helping TSR take in $300,000 in 1976. This growth prompted TSR to move out of Gygax's basement and into the Dungeon Hobby Shop in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Then, in 1977, TSR chose a new direction for their rapidly growing game. They produced two versions of the game, the Dungeons & Dragons Basic Set and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. The Dungeons & Dragons Basic Set was designed for new players, introducing them to the basic concepts of the game, rules for playing in dungeons, and simple character level systems. The box set was designed for sale in toy stores and included dice in the box, a first for Dungeons & Dragons. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons launched with its first supplement book, The Monster Manual, that same year. Now, you might think that once you got the hang of D&D basics, you could graduate to Advanced D&D, right? Nope. The rules between them made D&D and AD&D two distinct and incompatible games. Thus, you couldn't count on your rule books from the basic game to carry you through to the advanced game. So, if you wanted to level up and play something a little bit more dynamic, you had to buy new books. And that's called marketing.
I'm a businessman. I'm offering business opportunities.
But nothing good lasts forever. Thus began the era of lawsuits. Remember Dave Arneson, one of the guys who helped Gary Gygax create Dungeons & Dragons? Well, Arneson's Blackmoor was a major influence on the game's development, both in style and in rules, and was even wrapped into D&D as a supplement. He'd always had creative differences with Gygax and ended up leaving TSR in 1976. TSR agreed to pay Arneson royalties on the sales of D&D to the tune of 10%. But when the game line split into D&D and AD&D, Gygax refused to pay Arneson royalties, claiming that the game and rules were distinctly different than the original property.
Serious Business 101.
So you better believe Arneson sued TSR in 1979 for those sweet, sweet royalties. TSR eventually settled the case in 1981. TSR continued publishing tons of new supplements and modules for both Dungeons & Dragons Basic and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons throughout the late 70s. But wait, what's a module? If only I knew somebody who could explain that word to me. Oh, yes, movement, dice. Oh, yes, I didn't see you there. A module, yes. What is a module? A module is a collection of plots, settings, characters, locations, hazards, and outcomes to be used by the game master during play. Typically, a module, adventure, story supplement, or chronicle, which all are basically the same thing, will include goals for completion by the player characters as well as guidelines for success. Modules can be both linear and non-linear, depending on the desired outcome of the material. Additionally, modules can serve a multitude of different purposes and scopes, from single-session game introductions to multi-session adventures and long-term campaigns. Modules provide both players and game masters with less labor and time investment. Modules are a great value. Even if I could write a better adventure myself, I just don't have the time. I'm especially important. Mom! When's dinner? Want my chicky nugs? Thanks, Professor. I hope everything works out over there. Sales of Dungeons & Dragons continued to soar into the 80s, but the massive swell of popularity wasn't all positive. Join me next episode as we explore the dark side of D&D, as things start to get a little BADD in the 80s. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you liked this episode about Dungeons & Dragons. Is there something important that I forgot? Let me know in the comments down below. Join me next week for episode 2 and my D&D 5th Ed character creation tutorial coming soon. It's not chicky nugs, but Mom can make a mean grilled cheese. I get chocolate milk? Mom! Mom! I need chocolate milk. I'm gonna choke! Thought you wish your mom still made you grilled cheese. Reluctantly, Gygax agreed, and Melvin and Brian Bloom became primary shareholders of the company.
Who's Melvin Bloom?
It's Brian Bloom's dad. TSR produced the D&D supplements Eldritch Wizardry? Eldritch Wizardry? Did I wizard? I'm a wizard. Oh, like this.
Then take it out, don't say it. Say, and that's how you do marketing, suckers or whatever.
And was even wrapped into a I keep throwing like an extra thing in there.
That's okay.
Include goals for completion by the player. This is the part where it scrolls and it's going to cut to a different thing, and you won't see any of this, but you know, I figured, why not? It just keeps playing, so I know where to cut back in. A great value, isn't it? Oh. Rickety. Mom, is dinner ready yet? Damn it, I want my chicky nugs.